Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about SF collecting. 2 or 3 months ago I watched 4 or 5 videos on other channels talking about this topic, and I thought I would do one myself, but they covered virtually all the main points and I wasn't happy with my version, so I never released it. So I thought I would have another go now. And to do it differently, I'm going to talk about my collecting, and maybe I'll illustrate a few points while I do that. The thing I'm not going to talk much about is what to collect. I think everyone should make their own decision on what areas of SF they collect, which authors they collect. And if they want to do it from collecting series or from lists, by all means do so. I'm not going to make any recommendations myself, though I'm never unhappy to talk about books I've enjoyed, etc. So I'm going to start by talking about my collecting history, and I have lived in London my whole life, so my story is very much going to be London based. I do sometimes venture outside London, and I have bought books outside of London. I've even done trips to the States and bought many books over there. But basically these days I stick to London, and circumstances have changed. There are not the same opportunities that there used to be 10 and definitely not 20 or 30 years ago, when it was far better in London. Currently, my main source of books is charity shops. There are probably 60 or 70 charity shops that I visit each month. Some I visit weekly, some slightly more periodically. And those who've seen my book hauls over the last few months will see what I'm able to find, and it is rather limited, I think, in these days. I don't reject other sources. Over the years I've used many sources, be it car boots, jumble sales, used bookshops, though there are very few of those left. I look online, and I still hope to find a bargain there, but generally I've been a bit disappointed. And over the years I've probably only bought half a dozen 8 books a year online, perhaps a few more. Auctions are another possibility. I think in all the years I've been looking at auctions, I've probably bid on about 6 lots and won 3 of them. So they're worth looking at, but you're not always likely to find a bargain. And basically, I'm going to talk about why I still maintain it, because I've got a big collection of books. I'm struggling for space, so why do I carry on? I think everyone should think about why they collect or why they continue to collect. And for me, it gives me a reason to get out of the house. It gives me a reason to walk, because I have a free bus pass, so I can visit virtually all my charity shops by bus or train if I want, without any cost. It does take longer than if I drive, but by and large I do take public transport, and it gets me a fair bit of exercise. And every week I try and do my sort of 10,000 steps on at least, say, 2 or 3 days. I don't do it every day. And going out and looking for science fiction is a great excuse to do that. So that's why I'm carrying on and why I don't want to give up, because I wonder what I would do with my time if I didn't have that reason. Would I go out and do so many walks if I didn't have a shop to aim for? So enough about my current sort of hunting. And I suppose what I should do is go right back to the start. And when I was a kid, I think probably the first books I read, probably when I was 8 or 9, other than perhaps what teachers in school would read to us. And I'll show you, I'm not going to show you many books in this video, but I'll show you one that I think I probably got on about my 9th birthday, because this came out in 1961. So I probably got this at Christmas or New Year from my parents. It's not science fiction, it's facts about the solar system, basically, and what you can observe. And I was always very keen on space, the space story. So I've kept that book. It's not really relevant to my collection, but it does have sentimental value. And again, maybe another book I'll show you. This is not the one I would have had originally, but again, fantasy, The Magic Faraway Tree. I remember that used to be read to us in primary school, and I really loved it. And so in early days, I had an interest in science, in fantasy, and the other thing I collected from when I was about 8 or 9 was Superman and Batman comics. So if you like, that was the start of my interest in reading and my interest in SF, whether science fiction or science fantasy. And I sort of graduated from those early books to reading science fiction in my early teens. And initially, I was just a reader. I used to devour science fiction very fast. And in those days, most of the bookshops that I know, possibly all of them, used to stamp their books so you could read it and then take it back and get half back in credit towards another book. And that's certainly what I did for the first 3 or 4 years of my reading. But then, something I've never been very good at, remembering all the titles that I've read. A couple of times I would buy another book, start reading it, and realise within 2 or 3 chapters that I'd already read it. So I thought, I'm not going to do that. So I decided to keep them and create a list. In the early days, that meant using a typewriter. And basically, I started to collect books. And the other thing, the reason I would collect, which I still remember, was when I read a series, the one thing I used to hate was read book 1, then have to wait a few months till I read book 2, or until I could find a copy of book 2, and then so on for book 3. So I think one of my early decisions was to only start reading a series when that series was complete. And to build up that series, I needed to build up a store of books, so that eventually, when I had a full set, I would have the full set that I could read. So that was the start of my collecting habit. So my collection gradually built, and I'll be honest, in those early days, I wasn't really part of a science fiction collecting community. I used to chat to the bookstore owners, but I wasn't part of a big community. I was very much an independent collector, and I collected what I enjoyed reading. I collected those authors that I enjoyed. And So that goes back to my original point. When you're deciding what to collect, use your own judgment. And gradually my collection grew. And I suppose, I'm not certain when, maybe in the 80s, my collection of unread paperbacks exceeded the ones that I'd read. And gradually the ratio increased. And now, when I've perhaps got 16,000 titles in my collection, I reckon I've probably read 3,000 to 4,000 of them. I know some of which I've read, but some I'm sure I've forgotten about. And my apologies for the creaking, it's the chair I sit on. So that covers how I started and how I started building up my collection. In the early days, as I say, the only bookshops I tended to use were those that stamped the books. And I do not really remember when I started to seek out better copies. I think everyone does. If they've got a choice between a tatty copy and a nice copy, they'll always go for the nice copy. And because I was building a stock of unread books, I didn't really want to pick the tattiest copies to sit in that. So I often used to wait until I found a better copy, especially if it was a book that I thought was reasonably common. And I suspect that was the start of when I tried to collect for condition. I'm going to pause the video now for a brief break. Right, sorry about that break. I'm now going to talk about, if you like, why people collect. I mean, I've always been a bit of a collector. What is the psychology of that? I don't really know. Is there a spectrum of collecting? We all read in the news about people who go to one extreme, they declutter. You know, if they don't use something for 6 months, they throw it out. They want to do away with clutter. And at the other end of the spectrum, you've got people who hoard, who won't throw away anything. Well, I'm definitely towards that end of the spectrum, but I won't say I'm obsessive. I do part with books. Certainly when I get a duplicate or I upgrade a book, I do try and get rid of it. So there is the psychology, and I think it's worth working out your reasons. It helps to decide your priorities and decide why you're collecting. I'm sure there are other psychological factors, but I think everyone ought to just give a bit of thought as to why they collect. Another thing that I would perhaps mention in terms of collecting, which I'll put under the heading of resources, is deciding what resources you devote to collecting, whether that's time spent looking for books and searching, whether that's money. And I must admit, in the early days, when I was a student, that half-price exchange meant a lot. Whether it's space, a lot of people don't have the space to collect. And a prime example of a space issue is my book room. When I moved out of my flat and my wife and I moved back into my parents' old house, I slightly extended the house and I took over one bedroom for my books. And at the time, it didn't seem a silly promise. I set myself a limit that I would never come outside the one bedroom. I'd only keep my books in the one room. And I think it is important, especially if your partner or other half doesn't have the same interest in the collecting. So resources are a factor, and I think there's also an argument for putting limits on it. And certainly I would think until the 90s I had enough money to buy reasonably priced books, which is why I concentrated on paperbacks, because they were far cheaper than hardbacks. So I had money for that, but I didn't have the money to go out and buy expensive hardbacks. And so my main desire in collecting was the A format paperback. I never liked the trade paperbacks. And all right, I've had to change my view. Now I will buy B format paperbacks because you don't have a choice if you want to read newer SF literature. And I buy hardbacks because if there is a value in my books, it's much more recognisable in hardbacks. So after I moved into my mother's old property, I have changed my accounting aims. And I think that illustrates another point. Everyone should review which way their collection's going. If you're collecting a specific list, a specific publisher, there will come a time when you are nearing completion or fully complete. And you need, if you want to carry on collecting, then you need a new purpose, a new target. So again, another bit of advice I would say is review where you're going, but also I think it is worth having limits, and certainly being limited to one room, I have to try and be a little bit more selective in my buying. I haven't really managed that, but I try. Now I'm going to talk about perhaps the peak of my collecting. And that probably came about around the turn of the millennium. I'd never found the Fantasy Centre before because, as I said, I was a bit of a lone collector rather than part of a community. And I remember one of my wife's friends said there was a science fiction bookshop on Holloway Road. And I said, really? I didn't believe that. And so a week or two later, I went there and had a look, and I found the Fantasy Centre. And that sort of crystallised many of my sort of collecting habits. And I think it's around that time that I changed largely from being a reader to being a collector. And the Fantasy Centre, along with other science fiction bookshops in London, to me made London the best place in England. In terms of second-hand bookshops, there was the Fantasy Centre, there was at the Sign of the Dragon, there was in the basement of Murder One, there was the Charing Cross Road bookshops, and there were lots of bookshops around, but the decline had started. Since then, the number of bookshops has shrunk drastically. Not so drastically if you consider and count a charity bookshop as a bookshop, but the scope for collecting reduced and reduced. In the early 2000s, I used to go to Car Boots, and I did find some good buys there. But by 2020, I gave up going to Car Boots because I go to 7, 8, 9 on the trot and never find a single book. That's not to say I never found one. And I'm going to show you the last books in this video. And these were two I bought at a Car Boot. And it's two signed Terry Pratchett's, two early ones in the Discworld series, and they cost me £7 each, and they were both inscribed, and I don't know whether you call it a nice or a sad story, but the person who was selling said a friend of his had been in a hospice and he loves science fiction and fantasy, and he sent books off to authors, told them about his situation and asked them to sign. And Terry Pratchett sent these back signed, and I can't remember the exact quote, but the quote in here is something like, "And tomorrow they'll be flying in plane loads of sympathy." So this pair was probably my first ever true bargain of a valuable book found at a low cost. And since then, I've looked for similar bargains. I've found one or two over the years, not that many, but one or two. And certainly in the noughties and the tens, it was possible to find bargains. But nowadays, charity shops tend to look up nearly every book that they get. They price accordingly, and most of them haven't got a clue how to price to allow for condition. So the scope of getting bargains is hugely reduced these days. And one of the reasons people might decide they want to collect is to build up a valuable collection. And if you can do so by buying cheap, it is a real pleasure. If you're paying full price from some of the dealers, you're probably never going to make that much money. So I do sometimes buy a rare book and pay what I think is a fair retail price, but there's not the same pleasure as that you get when you find a bargain. So that is a bit of a potted history and fairly short history of my collecting. Where I am now, I'll briefly say, I think I said I've got something like 16,500 books in my collection. 1,600 are hardbacks. I can't tell how many B format paperbacks I've got, but I'm guessing that's at least another 1,000, maybe 1,500, because I never differentiated between A and B formats when I compiled my list. So I've probably got approaching 14,000 A format paperbacks, which was always the area I wanted to collect and where I started. Now, I mentioned about the Fantasy Centre. They were the ones who convinced me to start collecting for condition, so I did a lot of upgrading. They were the ones who convinced me to start collecting the Doors. At least I think they did. And Eric in that shop definitely suggested to me when I was looking for a new area to collect, he suggested the Timescape books. And I have collected some other series. So I'm not knocking those who collect from series. I've done it. I've succumbed to that. And so since about 2000, I've become a collector rather than a reader. And in terms of my channel, I might review the odd book, but I'm reading far less than I ever used to, and I don't feel I'm a natural reviewer. So having covered pretty much up to date, I'll now talk about the one which I haven't addressed yet really. What happens to my collection if I go or if something happens to me? I don't want to stop collecting now because, as I say, it gives me an interest. It gets me out of the house. It keeps me active. But if I don't do something, my wife will be left wondering what to do with the collection. I mean, I have made one or two suggestions as to what she might do. Whether she'll ever do that, I don't know. I mean, I did say eBay would been a good way to collect it. She'll get the most value that way. But with the change, and dare one say the oncoming death of eBay, with all their changes, will that even be feasible if something happens to me? And the other problem is, if you sell to bookshops, dealers, they're trying to make a profit. So basically you do not get a high percentage of the value of the book. So for me, it's a bit of an unresolved issue. Now, I do know one or two people who started to sell or have started to sell before they reach that stage. Maybe I will go down that route in a few years. I haven't decided. And I think there have been one or two videos about this. I remember Jules Vert did one. And it's something I think about, but it's not something I'm keen to rush to a decision on, because it may spoil what is my still probably primary hobby. So whether this video on collecting is of any interest to anyone, I do not know. By all means, leave comments and subscribe. As I say, I just wanted to air a few thoughts, and I hope you found it interesting. Thank you, that's all.